Our third speaker, who is experienced at doing these things, is already on her feet and on her way to the microphone. This is Amanda Holt.
Good afternoon. Are we in evening now? We're in that border, that time, and who knows what time it is. But it's good to be back again. It's good to see you all. I am here to provide you with, I'll emphasize, draft legislative district plans for consideration. And as we look at these, I would ask you to consider 5 things. So there are 5 considerations, 5 principles I would like you to consider as we look at these maps. And they're things that I considered as I worked on my draft map. So that's why they're relevant to discuss, although they're things that I have discussed with you all before, so they should probably be familiar to you. The first one is to consider the definition of absolute necessity, and to consider this as when no other recourse is available to meet the Constitution. So one part of the Pennsylvania Constitution, as you all know, states that divisions to jurisdiction should only be made unless absolutely necessary. If other constitutional parameters may be met without dividing a jurisdiction, is that split absolutely necessary? And I would suggest it is not, because a recourse exists to avoid it while still complying with the Constitution. I would also ask you to consider the definition of equal as practicable. This is something that was debated at length at the Constitutional Convention of 1968. It was unclear at the time what overall population range the courts would allow in legislative districts moving forward. Some thought 30% overall range would be fine. Others said it should be 20%. In the end, they decided to defer to the yet-to-be-determined court standard. And today, we know that to be a 10% overall range. But is that too high? Many U.S. Supreme Court justices have found it to be an acceptable range when it's been questioned in court. The minor harm it may cause is worth the ability it gives to protect the boundaries of jurisdictions and the voice of the people. In fact, the Constitutional Convention agreed. They found that divisions to jurisdiction should only be permitted to meet population thresholds. They did not suggest divisions should be allowed to create compact or contiguous districts. Delegate Baldrige, who was the one who introduced Proposal 1 as it was known then, said we do provide for the compact contiguous districts with no ward, borough, county, and so forth lines being divided unless absolutely necessary under the one man, one vote rule. Ignoring this rule to avoid divisions leaves discretionary decisions unchecked and exposes a district plan to manipulation. And it is the most common population range found in other state redistricting plans. 27 states used variances between 8 and 10%, or even greater than 10% in 2010. So I'd ask you consider not dividing jurisdictions for population reasons unless there is no other recourse available that would keep the plan within a 10% overall range. I would also ask you to consider the definition of contiguous. You may be familiar with this district, I'm sure. Thanks to Charles II, Pennsylvania has an island. There are also other small geographic anomalies throughout the state. In previous redistricting plans, these geographic anomalies were permitted to exist, even though technically not contiguous. I would ask you to consider continuing with this practice. Fourth, I would ask you to consider the definition of compactness. In previous redistricting plans, no precise or mathematical standard has been established. Because of geographic boundaries not falling into neat shapes, I would agree that this principle is better adhered to in a general sense rather than setting some kind of specific standard. I would also ask that you consider the definition of minority districts. So, while not covered by the Pennsylvania Constitution, districts must still not discriminate against minorities. So I'd ask you to consider Minority Districts 1, in which the voting age population of one minority group is greater than the white voting age population in that district. And so these considerations are reflected in the draft maps that I'm presenting today. And as we look at these, it's good to make sure we understand terms in the same way. So a big term I will use is splits, and there are two ways that splits can be referred to. There are the splits themselves, which count the number of times, or that count the number of places divided, and then there are total splits, which count the number of times a place is divided. And this is an example from the 2001 map of Monroe County. You can see it's one county, and it contains 5 total splits. I think that total splits is perhaps a more important number to consider, but you want to also look at the split count so that you don't end up with like another Monroe County situation, which of course was not good and was rectified in the 2010 maps, fortunately. Another term to consider is predetermined versus discretionary splits. So the predetermined means there's no choice based on population of the jurisdiction. It has to be divided that way, or there have to be that many splits in it. Discretionary is when you have a choice of where the split goes. And the number I think it's appropriate to focus on is the one that can be controlled, which is discretionary splits. So as I discuss the maps with you, my focus will be on those where there's an actual choice of where those splits might go. And I think the only permissible divisions are ones which are unavoidable to meet equal population or the Voting Rights Act requirement. So in the maps I will show you, I worked with a 10% overall range. And for the Voting Rights Act requirements, I referenced the number of minority districts and locations in 2011, as well as reviewing populations of neighboring districts that were being created in the maps. And adjustments were made using the minimum divisions needed to meet the Voting Rights Act requirements as presently understood. And more work maybe could be done in that area, as you may hear from testimony later. I will also add a disclaimer that I did not, when I was assigning district numbers, I made an effort to try to keep them within their current counties, but I might have failed. So there may be some strays. There's no slight intended there. And I didn't give consideration to incumbents in drawing them, although when I was making discretionary splits, I would consider school district boundaries. So I did find that there were divisions necessary to keep districts within the 10% overall range. I did find that it was necessary to make divisions to meet with the Voting Rights Act requirements. The districts that you will see are contiguous based on past practices, although both maps do include some geographic anomalies. And generally speaking, they are compact. So I think it's possible to draw districts that do comply with the Constitution and federal standards while still minimizing divisions. So you see here the total splits in the draft Senate plan that I sent you. There are 32 that are predetermined. And then there were 5 that I found that were necessary to either address population issues or for minority districts. And you can see that these still met the constitutional requirements by creating minority districts, by containing equal population, by having contiguous districts, and also compact districts. And there's a picture of what this particular version looked like. And then in the House, I found that there were 194 total splits that were predetermined to be necessary, and there were an additional 44 that were discretionary. And I did a little bit of a breakdown here on the right side. So I showed how many I found to be necessary for the purposes of population and how many were necessary for minority districts. And then you can see below that it still met with the constitutional parameters for minority districts, equal population, contiguous, as well as compact districts. And there is a picture of the House map, as well as in the southeast, a close-up of the southeast and the southwest for your reference. And I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, you packed a lot into your presentation. Are there any questions from members of the commission? How do these splits compare with the splits in the maps you drew 10 years ago?
They are comparable. I think the total split count was like 258 in the House, and this was a little less than that because I had to use, those maps used a lower population variance. So I think this is pretty much on par with what happened 10 years ago.
Senator Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Holt, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
And your point number 4, consider the definition of compactness, and you indicate that we should use a general sense of compactness, I believe, and not a mathematical formula or threshold. One of the things that we've been doing is measuring districts by looking at these different compactness tests. Are you suggesting that we should maybe do more of a visual look at a district to determine compactness, or a combination of both, or one or the other? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm suggesting, so for instance, the compactness measurements measure different types of things, right? So there are different ways to measure it. So the question is, if you are looking for a plan to have, let's say you decide the average plan should have a compactness score of 30 and you have one with 29, is that going to be unacceptable? Or does every plan have to have a district that reaches a certain threshold, meaning everyone has to meet a certain compactness, and then how do you decide which measurement you're going to use? So I think it's appropriate to reference them as a general rule to see like what their compactness scores might be, and those scores can be useful in helping evaluate how it's measuring up on compactness, but I think choosing to use a specific metric may not be quite as useful. Because if you have a district maybe that falls below because it's trying to accommodate, for instance, minority groups or something like that, they can sometimes be less compact, and you've now set a standard that says districts have to reach a certain threshold, and now that's gonna fall, out of line with that. I'm not sure that that's appropriate to do. So I think it's not just a visual. I mean, I think it's okay to use metrics and reference metrics. I just don't know that you want to have a specific number that you've assigned that says a district's not compact unless it reaches this particular number, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And if I could just ask another question quickly. Consideration number 5, the definition of minority districts. You indicate that voting age population of one minority group is greater than the white voting age population. So if we have a 34% Latino population and a 24% white and a 16% or 20% African American, is it your position that should be considered a Voting Rights Act minority district?
I don't know if it would be a Voting Rights Act minority district because they have specific standards about, what they qualifies under the Voting Rights Act, but I think it certainly constitutes the minority having a majority. I mean, the one case where it talked about the 50% threshold for minority districts was one in which I believe the white majority was at 60%, and they were debating whether the black majority could be 35% or 39%. So they could never form a majority that would be greater than the white voters in that district. And so I think that it's important to, while that's a good standard to follow the 50% rule, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that minorities can sometimes form a majority of a district and yet not still achieve the 50% threshold, if you will.
That's a coalition district, I suspect. Okay.
I think consideration should be given to those to some
Thank you
degree,
very much.
especially when they come very close to the 50% mark.
Thank you.
And do you have a tally, as Fair Districts did, about the number of minority districts that exist in these two maps?
Yes, on the summary page I did here, which I flew past, so I'll go back there again. You can see here, I did count the number of districts in which the black population formed the largest share of the voting age population. There were 4 in the Senate, 1 with Hispanics, and to Senator Costa's point, that one was not at a 50% threshold. I think it was 37 or 39%. And there was a coalition district there as well. And then on the House side, there are 19 districts in which blacks formed the largest share of the voting age population, 4 in which Hispanics formed the largest share of the voting age population, and 4 coalition districts. And I'll acknowledge that some of those, they may have been at like 49.4% instead of at 50%, but they still formed a greater share than the white voters. And it allowed in some instances for maybe them to have 2 districts, neighboring districts, in which they formed a greater share, or an almost greater share than the white voters. But there could be adjustments made there. So I don't know if that helps.
It does
answer
help,
your
and you
question.
did fly over it, so
I
thank you.
I did. I wanted to get to your questions. What can I say?
Are there other questions?
Just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Please.
Could you identify the 2 districts you referred to in the Senate as the 1 Hispanic share of VAP in 1 coalition district? Can you point to them on your map, or at least help me find them, or
Help you find them.
send me an email or something?
Yeah, I
whatever.
can send an email, because it's really, they're in the Philadelphia area, and it's really small here, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to point it out
Okay, well, if you
on
could
here.
send
But
that
I
to
will
me-
follow up with you on that, because I didn't do a zoom in on that particular area.
Okay,
Yep, but I can
Thank you.
definitely provide that to you.
yep, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think it's District 2 and 26. It just came to me.
2 and 26.
2 is Hispanic, and the coalition, I think, is 26, but I can confirm that.
And those are the existing district numbers, because we've had maps that have been renumbered.
It was an attempt. It's a little challenging to line up existing district boundaries with the one I was drawing, but it was an attempt. I will
Okay.
say that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.